Okay, so we have talked about the commutative property and associative property. So now our next property that we're going to talk about is the identity property. The identity property. And your identity, like a human's identity, is who they are. Okay? You shouldn't change who you are for anyone. So we're going to talk about these numbers having an identity, and if we don't want to change the numbers' identity either. So remember, you don't have to write down every single word. So let's first think of if we were going to add a number to 5, what could we add to 5 without changing the identity?
A 0.
As 0. And that is the rule for the identity property of addition. So you might want to write this part down. Identity property of addition says you can add a 0 to any number without changing the value of the number. Okay, so again, I would write this property down. Identity property of addition says you can add a 0 to any number without changing the value of the number. So I have 3 examples. 432 plus 0 is 432. 5.6 plus 0 is 5.6. 7 plus 0 is 7. So even negative numbers and fractions, it would work the same way. If you add 0, the number stays the same. Now, notice that this says the identity property of addition. We cannot have this same property for multiplication, because what would happen if you multiply by 0? The answer would be 0. So now we need to think to ourselves, so if identity property of addition is adding 0, what would be the identity property of multiplication, do you think?
1.
Multiply by 1. Excellent. So again, what number can you multiply by without changing the identity? You can multiply by 1. So here is that property. Identity property of multiplication says you can multiply any number by 1 without changing the value of the number. So I have some examples. Doesn't matter if it's a whole number, decimal number, fraction, negative number, big number, little number, doesn't matter. You multiply by 1, it stays exactly the same. Okay? So, in review, before we move on, we have 2 more properties to talk about. We have the commutative property, which is changing the order of the digits when you add or multiply. The associative property is changing the grouping, the parentheses, to make it easier to add or multiply. The identity property of addition says you can add 0 without changing the value. And the identity property of multiplication says you can multiply by 1 without changing the value. Okay, so the next one is going to be called the 0 property of multiplication. And there's not a 0 property for addition. It's only 0 property of multiplication. And it says that anytime you multiply a number by 0, it equals 0, no matter what. So 7 times 0, 46 times 0, 13.98 times 0. It could be, again, negative numbers. It could be fractions. Any number multiplied by 0 is 0. You guys knew that already, didn't you? You just maybe didn't know it was called the 0 property. All right, our last property is a property that you talked about in 6th grade as well, and it is called the distributive property. Do you remember hearing that word, distributive property? Mm-hmm. Okay, now I'm going to have some slides up here. There's going to be lots of words. Don't write it all down, okay? I will let you know what to write down, so don't have to worry about writing anything yet. Let's just kind of talk about some things about the distributive property, and then again, I will let you know what you need to write down. So with the distributive property, it says normally we see an expression like this, 4 parentheses 8 plus 3. We would use the order of operations to solve. So we would do what's inside the parentheses first and get 11, and then 4 times 11 is 44. However, with the distributive property, The distributive property, the number that's on the outside, you can multiply each of the numbers on the inside by that number on the outside. Remember, you're not writing all this down. Those of you that are trying to write so fast, you don't have to write it all down, okay? So we would do 4 times 8, which is 32, and 4 times 3, which is 12, and then you'd add them together. 32 plus 12 is 44. So we end up with the same answer. Now, you may be thinking, why would you do all of that work when it was so much easier to do 8 plus 3 is 11 than 4 times 11 is 44? I agree. The easier way would be 8 plus 3 and then 4 times the 11, all right? But the reason that a lot of times you use the distributive property is when you have variables, okay? So when you have variables like this one, again, don't write it yet, I promise there'll be time. When you have variables, you cannot add a variable to a number or a number to a variable. You can't subtract them either, okay? So in this problem, we wouldn't be able to do m plus 6. Those are called unlike terms, okay? Because one of them has a variable and one does not have a variable. However, even though you can't add or subtract unlike terms, you can multiply. So we could do 4 times m, and 4 times m would be 4m. And we could do 4 times 6, and 4 times 6 is 24. And then you're finished. You stop there. So many times people want to combine the 4m and the 24 and say 28m, but you cannot do that because, again, unlike terms, this has an m and 24 does not have an m. So you cannot add them or subtract them, so you would just stop right there. Do you remember doing any problems like this last year?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to do a couple to practice, okay? So go ahead and write this first example. 5 parentheses 2m minus 3. 5 parentheses 2m minus 3. So we're going to multiply the 5 times 2m first. What is 5 times 2m? 10m. Okay, halfway done. Now, there's a minus sign inside of your parentheses, so you're going to have a minus sign over here. That may change a little bit when we get to negative numbers, but we don't have to worry about that yet. Okay, so if you see a minus sign, that's what you use. And then don't forget, you also have to multiply 5 times 3. So don't just leave that 3. We have to do 5 times 3, which is 15. And then you're finished. Okay, 10m minus 15 is your answer. So you would not want to actually subtract anything here. You are only multiplying. All right, let's try this second example. 4 parentheses 6w plus 3. So we're going to do 4 times 6w. What's 4 times 6w?
24W.
24w. Do you think I should use a subtraction or addition sign? Addition. There's a plus sign there, so I want a plus sign here. And then don't forget, we want to do 4 times 3, which is 4 times 3 is 12. And you're finished. 24w plus 12. Finished. Do not add them together. One has a W and one of them does not have a W. All right, this last one. 6 times 5v would be what?
30V.
30v. Add or subtract? Subtract. There's a subtraction sign. So we want our subtraction sign. And then 6 times 4. 24. And again, stop. You don't actually subtract. And that's it. That is the distributive property. Okay, so on your assignment, you're going to have 2 different sections on your assignment, okay? Now, the first section has problems that you're not solving. All I want you to do in the first section is decide what property is being shown, okay? And I have a list of the properties at the top. And when you put your answer into the Google form, it'll be like a drop down. So So you can choose which property, okay? If you want to, instead of writing out the entire word, if for commutative you want to put a C, that would be fine. Associative A, distributive D, identity I, just use the first letter unless you feel like writing the whole word, okay? Now the bottom section, you're actually solving the problem, okay? So you could use the properties to help you with solving the problem. So you may need to distribute like we did here, or maybe you need to add or multiply. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so remember, complete the worksheet, and once you've completed the worksheet, then you go on to Google Classroom and you submit your answers onto the Google form that's attached for today's, for assignment number 4.
That's for a grade.
Yes, it's an assignment. Okay.